In this video, I'm going to talk about this absolutely gorgeous PC. Now, I don't usually build or review custom water-cooled PCs because I tend to swap computer parts all the time and it is just not practical for me. But when Nvidia reached out and asked if I was interested to check out this custom-painted, custom water-cooled Cyberpunk 2077 PC and then make a video about how it performs in a few games that support DLSS 3, I just couldn't resist. Because besides the fact that I will take any excuse to wear this jacket, Cyberpunk remains one of my personal favorite games, and I do get quite excited anytime I see anything related to it. Now, I also have to admit that when you spend most of your time just reviewing hardware and focusing on a lot of practical things and technical things and just looking at numbers, you tend to forget to appreciate how beautiful a PC can be when you take your time and put a lot of effort in making it look just right. But before I get into all the details, a big shout out to Game Styling for this super cool Cyberpunk artwork, and a huge shout out to Gijs from Redux Gaming for building this custom PC and for making it look absolutely on point. I will leave a few links in the description of this video, so if you want, you can check out other things they made and maybe even order yourself a PC like this one. Anyway, for the case they went with the NZXT H7 and I really think Game Styling outdone himself with this one. I love the bright yellow base that perfectly matches the Cyberpunk branding and all the little details that really round up this whole look. Especially the map of Night City on the side panel of this case. Inside we have an Asus ROG Z790 Hero motherboard, an Intel Core i9-13900KF processor, and 32GB of Kingston Fury DDR5 memory. The CPU block is EK's Quantum Momentum block that is specifically made for this motherboard, covering both the CPU and the VRMs. And of course, the center of this build is the RTX 4080 graphics card. Now, it is an Asus TUF model underneath, but then with an EK Quantum Vector block instead of the Asus cooler that the card comes with originally. It also has this 240mm EK Quantum radiator at the top and a 360mm radiator on the front of the case. But the fittings are all from the HydroX system from Corsair, just like the hard tubing that was used for this build. Now the coolant is again perfectly fitting UV yellow color, and there are a couple of extra UV LED strips that are on the front and on the top that make the yellow coolant really pop. And with all other RGB, especially the Lian Li fans that are set to light blue, it just looks amazing. But one of the biggest benefits of all this cooling is not that it looks great, but it runs extremely quiet. So while gaming, the fans do continue to spin at a very low RPM and the temperatures remain very comfortable. So if you're one of those people that values a silent PC, a custom loop might be the way to go. But let's see how it does when it comes to gaming. When you have an RTX 4080 and then you combine it with a proper processor like this i9, you do get a great all-around performance. So when I reviewed the 4080 a few months ago, I tested 27 different games and without any upscaling, I got 60 FPS or more in every single game on 4K resolution, but then with the majority of titles actually running 120 FPS or more. And if 60 FPS is not enough for you in those most demanding games, you can use upscaling to get basically every game running at 100 FPS or more. And since this is an RTX 4080, a big focus here is DLSS 3 that comes with frame generation. Now, frame generation basically uses NVIDIA's AI to generate extra frames in between regular frames. So it comes in really handy when your frame rate is a little bit lower, and it is especially useful for situations when you are CPU bound. And since this is a Cyberpunk themed build, let's start with Cyberpunk. Now, I don't expect anyone to game at 1080p with this build, but if you do, you will run into a CPU bottleneck at around 180 FPS. And we can see it's a CPU bottleneck because if you just turn DLSS upscaling on, nothing really changes. But with frame generation though, we're looking at 331 FPS instead. At a more realistic 1440p resolution, DLSS upscaling does work nicely, going from 142 FPS native to 180 FPS with DLSS on, where we hit that same CPU bottleneck. But With frame generation enabled, it goes up to 245 FPS instead. And this is very useful if you're planning to get one of those new 240Hz Quad HD OLED monitors, for example. Now, when it comes to latency, it does go up a couple of milliseconds, but it is a small difference, and in a game like this one, I just think it's worth the extra frames. At 4K resolution, the RTX 4080 does well at native resolution, but in my opinion, you should use DLSS upscaling anyways because it is noticeably smoother. And then with frame generation enabled, we go from 113 to 134 FPS with noticeably better 1% lows. You do get a heftier latency penalty, so I guess here you can decide what matters more to you. Do you want to go for more frame rates, a smoother gameplay, and higher latency, or you prefer to have lower latency but then without any of the perks that frame generation brings? Microsoft Flight Simulator, for example, is an extremely CPU-limited game in most situations. And if we look at native rendering, you can see a clear CPU bottleneck at 1080p and even 1440p. And because it's a CPU bottleneck, turning upscaling on doesn't really help much. Only on 4K resolution, it adds more performance. But then with frame generation on, we're getting a much smoother experience because it pretty much doubles the FPS of native rendering. Again, the latency is a little bit higher than when using native and a bit higher than when using DLSS upscaling only, but in this type of a slower paced game, it just doesn't matter as much. Spider-Man Remastered at high settings with ray tracing enabled also runs into CPU limitations at 1080p and 1440p and even approaches it at 4K once you factor in upscaling. So here too we can see some benefits from frame generation. Dying Light 2 is a bit of a different example. We're not running into CPU issues, but it is an extremely heavy game to run if you turn the ray tracing all the way up. And with every setting turned to the highest, even with upscaling on, we're only hitting about 60 FPS on 4K with 1% lows below that. But then with frame generation on, we're closer to 90 FPS, which makes the gameplay much more comfortable. Now on 1440p, it went from 107 to 143 FPS. Bright Memory Infinite is a new game that I hadn't tested before, but it is a title that also goes very heavy on the ray tracing, which does make it pretty hard to run. The 4080 handles it well enough, but the DLSS upscaling improves performance significantly, and then with frame generation enabled, even more so. Finally, the Formula 1 2022 on ultra high with ray tracing enabled is pretty tough on any GPU. So yet again, you really want DLSS enabled, especially at 4K resolution when it goes from 66 to 114 FPS. With frame generation, however, it was able to hit 140 FPS on average and get those 1% lows a bit higher as well. But on the other hand, F1 2022 is a game that can also benefit from super fast responses, so the latency penalty from frame generation might not be ideal for some people, depending on their playstyle. Now, technically, the latency with frame generation and NVIDIA Reflex is still better than if you were running native without Reflex, but you do get the best latency with just DLSS upscaling on, which also enables Reflex in this game. So here, you can decide what is more important to your playstyle, lower latency or even more frames. So while DLSS 3 is not a perfect solution for every single game and every single situation, it does make a significant difference in a lot of titles. Now, I don't think it makes sense for those competitive online shooters where every single millisecond of latency plays a big part in winning or losing a game. But for those big AAA titles that are extremely hard to run on any GPU, frame generation can be extremely valuable, which brings me to the final point of this video. On April 11th, CD Projekt Red is launching an update for Cyberpunk 2077, which introduces the Ray Tracing Overdrive mode. So currently, ray tracing only adds certain ray tracing effects to the game, and then with this update, Cyberpunk will get full path tracing, which means ray tracing will be present for every light source in the game. I haven't seen many details just yet, but it surely seems that this huge graphics boost will also be even heavier on your system than it already is. And if Minecraft RTX and Portal RTX are anything to go on, I personally expect that you'll basically need to have DLSS upscaling and frame generation enabled to even think about playing it. So when that update is out, I will be using this system to play Cyberpunk again. And I will also make another video about how that performs. And one last thank you to NVIDIA and to Redux for making this video possible, especially because when we're done with this project, I will be giving this awesome custom cooled PC away to one of you guys. So make sure you click that subscribe button, or at least keep an eye on this channel so you don't miss it. Thank you all for watching, and see you all in the next one. Bye!